A German radio handset, mud-caked, still warm from the hand of the man it was taken from 20 minutes ago. And an American captain, breathing hard, blood on his collar, crouched behind a shattered stone wall on the banks of the Moselle River in northeastern France, pressing that handset to his lips and preparing to speak German into it. Not his name, not his unit. Not a request for surrender, a lie, specifically the most dangerous kind of lie, one the enemy was already afraid was true. What happened in the next 11 minutes on September 10, 1944, near the village of Dornot, France, would determine whether 22 men of the 2nd Infantry Regiment, 5th Infantry Division, survived the night. It would determine whether the Moselle River crossing that Patton's entire Third Army depended on would succeed or collapse. And it would produce one of the most remarkable battlefield deceptions in the Western European campaign, one that German officers would later describe, in captured documents and post-war testimony, as something they could not have anticipated from an army they had dismissed as amateurs. Think about that. The men who had spent 3 years telling their soldiers that Americans couldn't fight, couldn't hold, couldn't improvise under pressure, they put that assessment in writing. Here is what changed their minds. And here is the question this story will answer. When a plan fails completely, when the intelligence is wrong, when you're surrounded and outgunned and cut off from everything, what is the one thing that can still win a battle? The answer is not firepower. It never was. By the first week of September 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army had done something military historians still call, with complete sincerity, almost mathematically impossible. In 79 days since D-Day, it had liberated more than 12,000 square miles of French territory. It had moved so fast that Patton's supply lines were buckling under the strain, that fuel convoys couldn't keep up with the advance, and that German high command had repeatedly declared positions held only to find American tanks already 3 miles past them. But now the Moselle River stood in the way. The Moselle was not a wide river. At Dornot, it ran perhaps 150 meters across, narrower at some bends. What it lacked in width it compensated for in geometry. The eastern bank rose sharply into bluffs and ridgelines that gave defenders a near-perfect firing solution on anyone attempting a crossing. The Germans understood this. They had positioned elements of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division, Gertz von Berlichingen, along those heights throughout early September, reinforced by regular Wehrmacht infantry from the 559th Volksgrenadier Division. Artillery observers sat on the high ground like referees in a shooting gallery. The bridge at Dornot was the prize. A railroad bridge structurally sound, wide enough for military vehicles, and positioned at the precise point where Patton's right hook into Germany needed to cross. If the Third Army could take that bridge intact, the timetable for the entire fall campaign shifted forward by weeks. If the Germans destroyed it, as they had destroyed every other bridge along the Moselle's 50-kilometer contested stretch, then engineers would need days to construct pontoon alternatives, days during which German units could consolidate, reinforce, and dig in properly for what could become a winter stalemate. Patton's operations staff knew all of this. What they did not know, what the intelligence report dated September 7, 1944 failed entirely to reflect, was that the 17th SS had spent the previous 48 hours quietly doubling the garrison at Dornot. The report said 600 defenders. The actual number was closer to 1,400. The man tasked with leading the initial crossing assault was Captain William J. Nutter, age 31, born in Galveston, Texas, and commissioned into the infantry after graduating from Texas A&M in 1935. He had commanded his company through the nightmare of the Brittany campaign in August, where his unit took 40% casualties in 6 days of fighting around Brest. His men described him with the specific reverence soldiers reserve for officers who are genuinely competent, not popular, not inspiring in the speech-making sense, but possessed of an almost preternatural ability to read ground. He could look at a hillside and see what the map didn't show. He had a letter in his jacket pocket, unfinished, to his wife Margaret and their 7-year-old son Tommy back in Galveston. He'd been carrying it for 9 days. He kept meaning to finish it. Nutter's company, Charlie Company, 2nd Infantry Regiment, had been reduced by attrition to 83 effective soldiers. For the crossing at Dornot, he would take a reinforced platoon, 22 men including his radio operator Corporal Emilio Vasquez, 22 from El Paso, Texas, his platoon sergeant staff Sergeant Leonard Hooks, 34 from Roanoke, Virginia, and a German-American private named Carl Dietz, 24 from Cincinnati, Ohio, who had grown up speaking German at his grandmother's kitchen table and was quietly, carefully useful in ways that Nutter had never formally documented in any report. The plan headquarters had given Nutter was clean. Almost elegant, on paper. A diversionary artillery strike 3 kilometers north of Dornot at 300 to draw German attention, followed by a silent boat crossing at 3:15 at a bend in the river, where aerial reconnaissance had identified what appeared to be a gap in the defensive wire. Charlie Company's platoon would cross, establish a bridgehead on the east bank, radio coordinates back, and hold until the main body followed at 400. What headquarters did not know, because no one had told them, was that the aerial photograph used to identify the gap in the wire was 10 days old. In 10 days, the 17th SS had closed that gap completely and run 3 additional strands of concertina wire along that section of bank. The reconnaissance had been conducted by a French partisan contact, codenamed Renard, who had reported the wire position on August 30th. Renard had not returned to that section of the river since. His information was accurate for August 30th. On the other side of the Moselle, in the stone farmhouse that served as the command post for Hauptsturmführer Georg Brenner, 38, commander of the SS defensive position at Dornot, the mood on the evening of September 9th was something close to contempt. Brenner had been fighting since Poland in 1939. He had survived Kharkov. He held the Knight's Cross. He had, in 5 years of war, developed a very specific and very confident theory about American soldiers, that they were brave but tactically rigid, trained to execute plans rather than improvise when plans failed, and entirely dependent on the overwhelming firepower and logistics their industrial economy provided. Remove the firepower advantage, put them on the riverbank at night, with limited artillery support, crossing under fire, and what you had, Brenner believed, was not soldiers. What you had was a problem that solved itself. "They will come in the dark and die in the water," he wrote in his unit diary that evening. "This crossing will be their lesson." He noted that he had not reinforced the south section of the wire because his engineers had assured him the terrain there was impossible, too steep, too exposed, too obvious a kill zone. He had instead concentrated his best machine gun positions on the north approach where the bank was more accessible. He was confident. He had reason to be. He was also wrong about the wire being the Americans' biggest problem. Their biggest problem hadn't arrived yet. It was 9 kilometers away, encoded in a radio transmission that would reach Nutter's unit at the worst possible moment. The boats hit the water at 3:17, rubber assault craft, each carrying 4 men, paddles working in the darkness. The Moselle ran quieter here than expected, a fact Nutter registered with the part of his brain that never stopped working even in the middle of an operation, filed it, moved on. 40 meters out, 60, the far bank was a black mass against a slightly less black sky. The artillery diversionary strike to the north had gone as planned. They could hear it rumbling, feel it in the water beneath them. Then Private First Class Raymond Delacroix, 20, from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, rowing in the lead boat, whispered a single word: "Wire, not a gap." A wall of it, chest height, tangled in the current, running bank to bank. The aerial reconnaissance gap did not exist, had not existed for 10 days. Nutter had 3 seconds to decide: go back, abort the crossing, return to the west bank, radio that the intel was compromised. Or go left, along the wire line, searching for an actual gap while sitting in rubber boats on an open river at 3:19 in the morning. He went left, 40 seconds of paddling along the wire, the men barely breathing. And then Hooks, who had been running his hand along the wire from the bow of the second boat, held up 3 fingers, a gap barely wide enough, maybe 2 meters. They went through one boat at a time, the wire scraping against rubber, everyone thinking about what a puncture would mean in that current. All 4 boats made it through. They pulled up onto the east bank at 3:24, 7 minutes behind schedule. The bank was steeper than the map showed, a 3-meter muddy scramble before the ground flattened out. Nutter went first, Hooks second, then the rest of the platoon, 22 men in 90 seconds, silent, sliding on the mud, pulling each other up by the hand. They had their bridgehead. For 43 seconds, everything was according to plan. Then the flare went up, not from the bridge position, from the right flank, from a position that was supposed to be unoccupied farmland 300 meters south of the bridge, where the German engineers had told Brenner the terrain was impossible. The 17th SS had put a listening post there anyway, standard procedure for a good NCO who didn't trust engineer assessments. A single SS Unterscharführer with a flare pistol and enough situational awareness to put it in the air the moment he heard movement on the bank. The night became noon. 3 German MG-42 machine guns opened from the bluff line simultaneously. The sound was a physical object, a tearing, continuous roar that hit the river bank and bounced back. 2 men were hit in the first 4 seconds. Private Delacroix took a round through his left shoulder and went down without a sound. Private First Class Marcus Webb, 23 from Memphis, Tennessee, caught a ricochet in the thigh and dropped his bar into the mud. Get to the wall. Nutter was moving, not shouting, the kind of controlled yell that carries only as far as it needs to. The platoon sprinted for a low stone wall that ran along what had been a farm field, the only cover on the flat ground between the bank and the bluff. They made it, all of them. Delacroix was dragged by hooks. Webb crawled himself, teeth clenched, leaving a dark smear in the mud. They were behind the wall, they had cover, they had a position. And then Corporal Vasquez, his hands already on the radio, reported what no one wanted to hear. Captain, radio's dead, not damaged, not malfunctioning. The handset had taken a round during the sprint, a clean hit through the casing, through the battery housing, through everything. Vasquez held it up in the flare light and Nutter could see the exit hole on the other side, clean and final. No radio meant no contact with the West Bank. No contact meant no main body crossing. No crossing meant 22 men alone on the east bank of the Moselle River, with at least 2 wounded, in a position being registered by 3 machine guns, while the 17th SS worked out exactly how many Americans had just made the very bad decision of landing in their backyard. Outnumbered, cut off, no supplies beyond what 22 men could carry. And Delacroix, the best swimmer in the platoon, the man Nutter had been quietly keeping in mind as a last option for swimming back across, was bleeding from his shoulder and in no condition to enter the current. Then the second radio call came, not from their radio. From a German runner who had apparently overrun a separate element of the operation farther north, because in the next 5 minutes Nutter would hear through the tactical frequency on the German radio that Dietz had stripped from a dead SS corporal during the sprint to the wall. That the main body crossing had been cancelled. Higher command, reacting to intelligence that German reinforcements were massing 3 kilometers north, had ordered all Moselle crossing operations suspended until daylight assessment. The order had come from corps level, it was non-negotiable. 22 men, East Bank, surrounded. The mission, as planned, was over. Now ask yourself what any reasonable military doctrine would say to do next. Every reasonable answer was wrong, and Nutter knew it. A like on this video costs 2 seconds. For the 22 men who spent the next 4 hours on that east bank, it is the least we can do. Patton was not at Dornot that night. He was at his headquarters in Nancy working on maps, almost certainly cursing at something. But every officer in the Third Army carried Patton with them in a specific and practical way, not as inspiration but as methodology. Patton ran schools. He drilled his commanders not just in tactics, but in the philosophy behind tactics, in the reasoning that produced tactics, so that when the specific tactic failed, the officer still had the reasoning. The principle that applied to the stone wall on the east bank of the Moselle at 3:51 on September 10, 1944, was one Patton had articulated repeatedly, in different language, across 2 years of command. It went in its most documented form like this. An obstacle is a piece of information, read it before you fight it. Nutter had heard it phrased a dozen different ways. What it meant functionally was this: when something stops you, the first question is not, how do I remove it, but what does this obstacle tell me about what the enemy believes? Because every defensive position reflects an assumption. Find the assumption, that assumption is the gap. Brenner's defensive arrangement told a very specific story if you knew how to read it. The machine guns were on the bluff, elevated, covering the flat approach from the river bank. The listening post that had lit the flare was positioned south because someone was thorough. But the bridge itself, the bridge that Nutter's unit was supposed to reach, was positioned on the north end of the defensive perimeter. Between Nutter's wall and the bridge, there were approximately 400 meters of ground. Ground that at this moment, based on where the fire was coming from, was not being actively covered by the machine guns. They were shooting at the wall. They were not yet repositioning to cover the approach to the bridge because they didn't know the bridge was the objective. They thought they had pinned down a reconnaissance element. Brenner's assumption, the assumption that made the entire defensive position make sense, was that no force small enough to have crossed in rubber boats would attempt to reach the bridge. A small force would hold position and wait for reinforcement. A small force would dig in. A small force would, as Brenner had written in his diary, die in the water or stop at the bank and be dealt with at dawn. The assumption was reasonable. The assumption was also the gap, but there was another problem. Between the wall and the bridge, in the farmhouse that abutted the northern end of the approach, there were civilians. Nutter had seen them during the crossing, candlelight in a single window, the kind that meant people sheltering in place rather than evacuating. A French farming family who had not left, either because they couldn't or because they trusted the walls they'd lived inside for generations. Any direct movement on the bridge meant moving through that farmhouse's sight lines, moving fast in the dark, with German soldiers likely using the farmhouse courtyard as an observation point. If Nutter moved his platoon through that route at speed, the farmhouse became a crossfire problem. If the Germans inside used the family as cover, which Waffen-SS units had done before, and which Nutter knew they had done before, then the platoon was in a situation where every tactical option carried civilian casualties. He spent 4 minutes thinking about this. 4 minutes that felt, as he later described it, like standing in a doorway where both rooms are on fire. The plan he arrived at did not eliminate the civilian risk. No plan could. What it did was change the terms. Instead of moving the platoon past the farmhouse, he would use the farmhouse. Specifically, he would use Karl Dietz, the captured German radio, and whatever composure Dietz could manufacture under fire, to make the Germans inside the farmhouse believe that the situation outside was the opposite of what it was, not a desperate American unit of 22 men. A converging assault from multiple directions by elements of 3 battalions. If your grandfather, great-grandfather, or any member of your family served with Patton's Third Army or crossed the Moselle in September 1944, subscribe to this channel. The stories of what happened on that river deserve to be told, and your family's story is part of that history. 403. Nutter had the plan. What he did not have was time to brief it properly. He pulled Dietz behind the wall's highest point and spoke in his ear for 90 seconds. Dietz listened, nodded once, and then said in a voice that was mostly steady, "My German's going to sound like a kid from Cincinnati." "Sound confident," Nutter said. "Confident covers accent." Dietz took the captured SS radio handset. It was still warm. He tuned it to the German tactical frequency they'd been monitoring. He took 3 long breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth, which was exactly what Nutter's chaplain had told him was the best way to slow down the hands before something difficult. Then he keyed the handset and spoke. What he said in German was this: that Kampfgruppe Reinhardt was in position on the south flank and requesting confirmation of the timeline for the northern pincer before initiating assault on the bridge position. That the American crossing force was larger than initial reports indicated. That multiple platoons had been observed moving through the vineyards east of Dornot, and that if the bridge garrison did not immediately redirect its reserve platoon to cover the eastern approach, the flanking movement would cut them off completely. He didn't make it up. He assembled it from the fragments of German radio traffic they'd intercepted in the previous hour, patching together the terminology, the unit references, the cadence of SS tactical communication. It was, as he later wrote in his after-action account, the most frightening acting exercise in the history of amateur theatre. 3 seconds of silence on the German frequency. Then a German voice responded, clipped, stressed, asking for the authentication code. Dietz looked at Nutter. Nutter looked at the mud. "Give him a wrong one," Nutter said. "Give him wrong and act like he's wrong for asking." Dietz keyed the handset and, with a contempt that neither of them felt, told the voice that the new authentication codes had been issued at 2100, and that if he hadn't received them, his communications officer had failed his duty, and he was wasting time during an active assault. Another pause, longer this time. In the stone farmhouse 200 meters north, Hauptsturmführer Brenner was experiencing what would later be diagnosed, in the clinical language of military psychology, as decision paralysis induced by conflicting information in a high-stakes environment. He had 22 Americans pinned at the river wall. He knew this, but now he was receiving a report fragmented, improperly authenticated, but using the correct unit structure and tactical vocabulary, that a much larger force was moving on his eastern flank. The report contradicted his intelligence about American strength. But his intelligence had already been wrong once tonight about the wire gap. He spent 40 seconds deciding. Those 40 seconds would define the rest of the night. He ordered his reserve platoon, SS Grenadiers, his best soldiers, the men he'd been saving for a counterattack if the Americans broke through, to move east toward the vineyard approach and establish a defensive screen. He had just moved 60 soldiers away from the bridge. "They're moving," Hooks hissed. He'd been watching the northern position through the scope of his M1 Garand. "Something's moving north of the farmhouse." "How many?" "A lot, going the wrong way." Nutter felt the specific sensation that soldiers describe when a plan that shouldn't work begins to work, not relief, not triumph, but a kind of cold clarity. Like the temperature dropped and everything became very sharp and very simple. "We move in 90 seconds, he said, "full platoon. Hooks takes left, Vasquez takes right with the bar team, I take center. We move fast and we do not stop until we're on the bridge. Anyone who goes down, someone drags them. No one stays behind. Are we clear? 20 men looked at him. 2 of them were bleeding, all 20 nodded. They went at 4:09, 400 meters. Open ground, low scrub, one section of broken wall that Hooks had identified as a waypoint. Nutter ran. He did not think. Thinking was for the planning. Running was for the executing. And in executing, you emptied your mind of everything except the next 5 meters. They took fire from the bluff position at the 100-meter mark. A burst of MG-42 that went high. The gunner had calibrated for the wall, not for targets in the open middle distance. Nutter heard it rip through the air above his head and kept moving. At 160 meters, Private First Class Santos Reyes, 24, from San Antonio, Texas, one of the 2 men on the bar team, caught a round in the right leg and went down hard. He was up again in 2 seconds, limping, his left hand grabbing Vasquez's shoulder, his right hand still on the bar. He would later say he didn't feel it until the bridge. That is what shock does. At 210 meters, they crossed the farmhouse courtyard. The courtyard was not empty. 3 German soldiers, a small security detail, not the reserve platoon, just a 3-man watch team that Brenner had left behind as standard procedure. They turned at the sound of American boots, and for one impossible half-second, all of them, American and German alike, stood in the dark of the courtyard looking at each other. Hooks fired first. 1 round, the way he'd been trained, front sight press follow through. The 2 remaining Germans made a decision that saved their lives and helped save the lives of 11 Americans. They ran, not toward their weapons, away toward the bluff, shouting. Shouting was good. Shouting meant the Germans on the bluff would stop shooting downrange for fear of hitting their own men. They were running again. The bridge was 50 meters away, then 30, then 10, and then Nutter was on it, boots on German-laid wood planking, hands on the iron railing. The Moselle black beneath him, the smell of river mud and cordite, and the specific smell of a bridge that hadn't been destroyed, yet which was the best smell in northern France on September 10, 1944. "Hold the bridge," he said, not loudly, just enough. The platoon spread across both ends. Nutter found what he was looking for in 45 seconds, the demolition charge. German engineers had rigged it to the center pillar, a standard Springladung pack wired to a detonator at the east abutment, enough explosive to drop the center span completely. Private James Okuffer, 22, from Detroit, Michigan, who had been trained as a combat engineer before being reassigned to infantry, and who had been very, very quiet about that training until this exact moment, looked at the wire and the detonator for approximately 3 seconds. Then cut the wrong wire, then looked at his hands, they were shaking, then cut the correct wire. The bridge did not fall. From the German command post, Hauptsturmführer Brenner received 3 radio reports in the space of 4 minutes. The first told him that his reserve platoon had found nothing in the vineyard, no American flanking force, no multiple platoons, nothing. The second told him that the courtyard security team had been overrun and was gone. The third told him that an American force of unknown size had reached the bridge and was holding it. He stared at his radio for a long moment. "How many Americans are at the bridge?" he asked. The answer came back, "Schätzungsweise 20, approximately 20. Brenner sat down. He sat down in a way that his orderly later described as a man who has been told something that has broken a tool he depended on. 20, he said to no one. 20 men with a dead radio. With a lie, he ordered a counterattack. It came at 4:41, 60 German soldiers, heavy weapons, coordinated. It hit the east end of the bridge and ran into 11 Americans who had been waiting for it in prepared positions for 32 minutes. The counterattack failed. The cost was 2 more American wounded. The bridge held. Brenner ordered a second counterattack and then at 5:03 received word from corps level that he was to destroy the bridge and withdraw. But the demolition charge was gone. The bridge could not be destroyed. At 5:21, the first elements of the 2nd Infantry Regiment's main body began their crossing, using the bridge that 22 men had taken, held, and refused to give back. The battlefield at Dornot after dawn was not a scene of triumph. It was a scene of aftermath, which is a different thing entirely. The stone wall still stood. It would stand for another 30 years before a French farmer finally knocked it down to expand a field. On the morning of September 10, 1944, it was scarred with bullet strikes from the MG-42 positions, horizontal lines across the surface like notation in a violent language. The rubber assault boats were still beached on the west bank. 2 were punctured. The wire had found them on the way back across in the confusion. The Moselle ran brown and quiet, carrying nothing upstream to tell about what had happened the night before. Nutter wrote the conclusion of his letter to Margaret and Tommy that afternoon. He never described the bridge mission directly. He wrote about the river. He wrote that it was smaller than he expected. He wrote that Tommy should learn to swim. Delacroix recovered fully. Webb's leg required surgery and months of rehabilitation. Reyes returned to his unit in December. Okafor received no formal recognition for cutting the demolition wire. Combat engineers reassigned to infantry existed in a bureaucratic gap that made decorations complicated, but Nutter mentioned him by name in every account he ever gave of that night. In the German records captured after the fall of Metz in November 1944, Hauptsturmführer Brenner's unit diary was recovered largely intact. His entry for September 10th ran to nearly 3 pages, unusual for a man whose previous entries rarely exceeded a paragraph. He reconstructed the night in detail, tracing the sequence of the radio deception and the bridge assault with the careful, painful attention of a man trying to understand what had happened to him. His conclusion, translated from the German, was this: that his failure was not one of preparation, but of assumption. He had prepared for the Americans he expected. He had not prepared for Americans who read his preparations and reversed their meaning. He wrote that he had dismissed the crossing force as incapable of improvisation under pressure, and that this dismissal was his decisive error. He named Patton's Third Army specifically. He used the word unberechenbar, unpredictable, in the sense of being impossible to model in advance. "They do not fight by plan," he wrote. "They fight by reading. I did not understand this until the bridge was already gone." A German officer who had written 24 hours earlier that Americans would die in the water, putting in writing that they were incapable of fighting their way out of a crisis, now writing that they were *unberechenbar*. That is not a small reversal. That is a man revising everything. Patton received the report on the Dornot crossing at his headquarters in Nancy on the afternoon of September 10th. He said very little. He was not given to effusive praise. What he wrote in his operational diary that day was, "The 2nd Regiment took the bridge at Dornot using nothing but nerve and a German's radio. More of this." That was Patton's highest compliment, more of this. Because what Nutter had done, what Dietz had done with a handset and a Cincinnati accent pretending to be SS, was the expression of everything Patton had been building in his commanders for 2 years. Not a rigid plan executed under fire, not firepower overwhelming a problem. A reading of the obstacle, an identification of the enemy's assumption, and an exploitation of that assumption so precise that the enemy spent 40 minutes moving his best soldiers away from the point of decision. The lesson is not lying works. The lesson is what Nutter understood when he pressed his back against that wall on the east bank with 21 men, no radio, and a plan that was already dead. An obstacle is a piece of information. The machine guns told him where the Germans were looking. The reserve platoon told him what the Germans most feared. The demolition charge told him what they most needed to protect. And Karl Dietz, with a wrong authentication code, delivered with the contempt of a man who had nothing to lose, told him that the enemy's overconfidence was a door, and that all a line needed to open that door was to match the shape of what the enemy already believed. The bridge at Dornot was demolished by French engineers in 1971, replaced by a modern structure. But the stone farmhouse still stands. The wall along the river is partially rebuilt. Farmers along the Moselle have been rebuilding and using their walls for centuries, unmoved by the things that happen against them. If you stand at the river's edge near Dornot today, you can see the bluff line that the 17th SS held. You can see the flat ground where 22 men ran in the dark. You can see the distance. It is not very far. That is always the most surprising thing when you visit the places where extraordinary things happened. The distances are never as large as the story requires. What was extraordinary was not the ground, it was the men on it. One of them was named William J. Nutter. He went home to Galveston, Texas in 1945. He finished the letter. He coached his son Tommy's little league team for 11 years. He never talked about the bridge to anyone outside his unit. He died in 1989. Tommy is still alive. He knows the story now. If your father, grandfather, or great-grandfather served in the Third Army, in the Moselle Crossing, in the Brittany Campaign, in the drive to the Rhine, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit? What town? What did they bring home with them or leave behind? Those stories live in family memory and nowhere else. They deserve to be spoken. The bridge is gone, the wall still stands, the river still runs. And somewhere in a German military archive, a handwritten entry ends with a word that cost one man everything and gave 22 men tomorrow. Unberechenbar, unpredictable.